Well, I'm going to at least start the proceedings. Just to first welcome you and welcome those who'll be coming in due course. I acknowledge the prior ownership of this land and Aboriginal elders who are custodians of the land, and I think I'm currently on Gadigal land. As I say, welcome. This is our second in a series of seminars that were run last time by the Theological Research Network of the Sydney College of Divinity. That was very successful. We had 7 of these seminars culminating in a conference that was on the pandemic. This time around, we've partnered with ISCAST and we're running another 2-year series. So these seminars will run for the next couple of years. We've got 12 speakers already lined up for those 2-year programs. And this time it's on science and religion. So being religiously human in a techno-scientific world, theological, missional and pastoral perspectives. I'd like to invite Chris to just say a few words. Chris Mulheron as coordinator of ISCAST.
Thanks, Neil. I don't need to say much except to add my welcome. We are very grateful to Neil and the SCD for enabling this series and allowing ISCAST to partner in this second series. Obviously, many of you know what ISCAST is about. We're about promoting a constructive conversation between the sciences and Christian faith here in Australia. So the topic of this series is right up our alley, and we're very happy to be part of it.
Well, it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker for today, Dr. Mark Worthing. Mark is one of those rare characters who bothered to get himself 2 doctorates, one in history and philosophy of science and the other in theology. He's also a prolific author. He's written 8 books that I'm aware of and is currently, get this right, the Dean of Melbourne School of Theology, Frontier School for Mission Program, as well as being pastor at the St. Peter's Lutheran Church at Port Macquarie. Today, Mark is speaking on models of the relationship of science and religion in science fiction and what they reveal about contemporary attitudes towards religion. When he's concluded, we will be having a response from Reverend Dr. Glen O'Brien, who's still with the Salvation Army, I think, Glen, Salvation Army College in Melbourne. I'll hand it over to you. Then we'll have a short break and open it up for questions. So Mark, it's over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Neil. Thank you, everyone, for attending this afternoon. When I first heard about this series, invited to participate, I delayed a little bit in responding. So by the time I responded, a lot of topics have been taken up, and Neil said, well, science fiction and religion is still left. So being a keen reader and sometimes editor and even writer of fantasy and a little bit of science fiction, and having done a book some years ago on the Matrix trilogy, it seemed like something I'd be interested in giving a hand at. One of the first things I realized was that the material is very broad and vast indeed. So for those hoping that I will cite all of your famous graphic novels, comics, films, movies, streaming things, etc., I might miss a few. I'm trying to use some indicative choices and give some sort of overview of how we might categorize the vast field of science fiction and what we could actually learn from it. So, as you may realize, for keen readers of speculative fiction, as a category, it provides very rich avenues for exploring religious themes. The ability to create entirely new worlds gives significant scope for looking at the big questions of life. Fantasy literature in particular has been embraced by Christian writers seeking to explore the contours of their faith as transposed into imagined realms. George MacDonald, followed the next generation by C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien, set the standard for the exploration of openly theological themes among Christian writers of fantasy. And this is something I've explored in an earlier work. And after I've done that, a number of people had asked, is the situation similar with science fiction? it is a bit different. Science fiction is, of course, distinct from what we find in fantasy literature, and that's something that we need to take into consideration. In science fiction, the imagined worlds its characters inhabit are explained not by magic or as the creation of the gods or simply because they are there, but by science, or at least a fictionalized version of science. And for those engaged in the science and faith dialogue, this distinction, as we will see, is significant. In science fiction, in contrast to fantasy, for instance, there is a genuine attempt to explain how things might be possible. Even if these explanations are themselves implausible, they still exist. People enter other worlds through spacecraft that are capable of travel at warp speed or through hyperspace. Apes in the Planet of the Apes are able to talk because they evolved over time to have this ability. People journey far beneath the sea or into the Earth's core, as in Jules Verne, or even into the human body because vehicles have been developed capable of taking them to these places. The actual technologies may fall beyond the pale of current scientific credibility, but there's no mystery involved within the world of science fiction itself as to the how of things. Another important observation about the distinction between science fiction and fantasy is that while fantasy has tended to attract significant numbers of Christian writers and other religious writers who have actually long dominated the genre, science fiction has tended to attract self-proclaimed atheists and agnostics as well, and even perhaps more so. The reason for this is perhaps obvious. Those whose metaphysical commitments are to a world devoid of deities and the supernatural are more comfortable creating imagined worlds based upon science. Of course, there's also been a number of overtly Christian and other religious writers of science fiction, and we will make reference to some of them in this paper. As alluded to earlier, the quantity of science fiction in both print and film is vast. Any study of science fiction from the perspective of the science and faith dialogue will need to specify the focus of this study. And for my paper today, I've chosen to focus on science fiction that is predominantly utopian. The interesting question is this: in worlds in which science and technology largely deliver on their promise to bring about a new and better future, what place is there, if any, for religion? In going over the great volume of popular as well as niche science fiction, I've tried to choose a representative selection from the various sci-fi media, from various eras of sci-fi writing, and from a range of approaches to the representation of religion. But there is still an almost overwhelming scope of material. When faced with such a range and volume of material, some system of categorization clearly was needed for sorting and understanding the data. In looking at previous studies and what they have done in this area, I noted several examined messianic figures in science fiction. Such studies are fascinating as we deal not only with alien Christ, but also time travelers who go back in time to meet the actual Jesus, including one hapless traveler who ends up becoming Jesus in Michael Moorcock's Behold the Man from 1968, Jesus on Other Planets, for instance, P.H. Farmer's Jesus on Mars, and clones of Jesus, such as the naturally occurring clone in Peter James' best-selling Absolute Proof, the comedy Honk If You Are Jesus by Peter Goldsworthy, an Australian writer, and the serious faith and science exploration by molecular biologist Martinez Hewitt in Divine Blood, a novel of science and faith. But this approach leaves out the many stories that do not include such messianic figures. It also does not take into account the distinctive range of approaches to such messianic figures. And there is significant difference, for instance, we find in the messianic approach and status of Superman, Neo from The Matrix, and Paul Atreides from Dune. Other studies have looked at religious themes ranging from heaven and hell, angels, sin, forgiveness, and creation. These studies are interesting in terms of the individual topics addressed, but provide no suitable template for a broader analysis of the portrayal of religion in science fiction generally. I then considered whether the approaches to science and faith in science fiction might largely be parallel to what we find in real-world encounters between science, and faith. And I began cataloging and looking at data and grouping the material together, first in terms of science fiction stories that were positive in their approach to religion, and then those that are negative. I felt this was still a bit too broad, so I subdivided each of these categories into two further ones and ended up with 4 basic approaches or models. Stepping back and looking at them, I thought, this looks familiar. And then I realized where it was familiar from. Ian Barber, in his Gifford lectures in 1989 to 91, publishes Religion and Age of Science, put forward 4 famous models of relationship between science and religion. And essentially, I found that the models I put forward had largely paralleled these with some difference. So the lesson was that there may only be certain ways of approaching how science and religion relate. And if you create this in a fictional world of science fiction, you basically end up with the same models with some interesting adaptations that we'll see when we get to them. So what were Barber's 4 models? He says that science and faith relate in one of 4 ways. The first is the conflict model, in which, of course, science and religion are always necessarily in conflict. There's the independence model, in which they basically exist independently of one another with no real connection. The dialogue model, in which they're actually engaged and in communication, dwelling in the same world, and the integration model, in which they merge together through mutual interaction to produce one unified worldview. With some adaptation to these unique features due to the train of science fiction, I'm proposing that we can put forward and analyze science fiction within these 2 broad categories. So first, the 2 more negative models. Model 1, religion is either on the fringe of society and occurs as a problematic outlier, or it lays at the heart of evil empires and movements that rise up determined to conquer all worlds and impose their religious views. The reality of religion and faith is recognized, but is seen as a decisively negative and evil influence. And this corresponds to Barber's conflict model, which assumes that science and religion will inevitably be in conflict with one another. Now, given the amount of conflict literature on both sides of the science and religion discussion in our real world, I was actually a bit surprised that this model contained relatively few examples. But this is partly explained by the fact that in my own study, I excluded dystopian worlds from my survey for reasons I gave earlier, and they do tend to come up a bit more there. So I suspect that might partly explain that. When the conflict model does occur in science fiction, it's revealed in religious movements, ideas, and leaders necessarily being in conflict with the otherwise secular and scientifically and technologically advanced culture around them. Sometimes this manifests itself in open opposition to science and technology, but more often than not, it is seen in religion using technology for its own, usually nefarious ends. The religion of the Ori in the Stargate television series is a classic example of this portrayal of religion. In a world with space travel and portal gates and ever more technology to make life better, the one major threat to the inhabited worlds of the galaxy is the seemingly unstoppable spread of a religion that conquers by force and imposes its rule ruthlessly. The Ori, with their robes, rituals, and fanatical beliefs, easily draw upon images from the history of Muslim conquest, Christian crusades, conquistadors, the Inquisition, enforcement of Sharia law, etc. It's hard to miss the message about the inherent danger of organized religion, which uses technology not only for conquest or control, not for the betterment of humanity. In Planet of the Apes movies, the original from 1968, particularly fits within this category. In the original Planet of the Apes movie, an ape scientist fights for truth and openness over against ideas that are largely religious and must be protected at all costs. In fact, the scientist who seeks to help the human protagonist in the original film is even put on trial for religious heresy. Many aspects of this story are a very thinly veiled commentary on the relationship of science and religion in our own world as interpreted through a conflict model lens. And one other I might add here that's a little bit different. Star Trek Next Generation, I think, delved into this portrayal of religion in a bit different way in an episode called The Devil's Due, in which an advanced alien impersonates the character of the devil in holographic form and its equivalent from several other planetary mythologies for her own gain. Religion is being used for evil purposes, but at the same time is shown not to be real, which crosses over somewhat into the next model that I'd like to consider, and that is this: the second negative model of religion and science in science fiction. There's little or no role for religion in a scientifically advanced future. As scientific knowledge and technology grow, religion fades away. This model, I think, corresponds loosely to Barber's independence model. In the real world, religion and science kind of get on with things in this model independently, pay each other little heed. In the worlds of science fiction, if there's no connection or interaction between science and religion, then a writer writing about an advanced world just simply doesn't need to mention it at all, unless it's to explain why it's not there or why it's not important. Though some classic writers of science fiction, including people like Arthur C. Clarke, The 9 Billion Names of God, which pits computer geeks against Tibetan monks, or Philip K. Dick Ubik, The Divine Invasion, When Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, did not shy away from overtly religious themes, many others have. But we must note that in many cases, the absence of religion and religious ideas in science fiction is not necessarily seeking to make a religious statement. Just for a bit of an exercise, in my own writing, I've only ever done one work of science fiction, a young adult novel called Chelsea McAllister and the Bubblegum Effect. And it's about a girl who time travels, accidentally radically changes her world by going too far back in time. And I decided to analyze the text to see where to categorize it. And of course, I was a bit surprised. The only religious reference I could find was to the main character's alternate timeline mother being devoted to an intergalactic religious cult dedicated to the obscure but seemingly benign desire to plant geraniums throughout the universe. There was no overt religious influence in the story or in the characters. At the time, I felt the story was too short to go into the complexities of religious subtext. So apart from the geranium cult, I simply left it out. Technically, I guess I'd have to place it in this category, but like many other works of science fiction that make little or no reference to religion, it really doesn't quite fit there. Religion is absent not because I, as the writer, was making a point, but because I didn't have the scope to deal with the complexity of religious belief. But there are many instances in science fiction which the omission of religion is deliberate, intentional, pointed even. Some writers and critics believe there is simply no place in science fiction for religion. Science fiction critic Darko Suvin writes and represents this view when he says, all attempts to transplant the metaphysical orientation of mythology and religion into science fiction will result only in private pseudo-myths, in fragmentary fantasies, or fairy tales. When storylines make a point of underscoring the absence of religion, of regularly referring to the bad old days when religion had great power, or of referring to long forgotten gods and long abandoned temples and monasteries, when there's talk of science replacing the need for faith, then the absence of religion becomes something clearly intentional. It is these stories that we are most interested in here and which belong most properly to this model. The original Star Trek series is probably the most prominent example of this. Star Trek dominated our imaginative thinking about space for almost everyone on the planet born after 1950. The original series of 79 episodes ran from September 1966 until June 1969 and set out to seek new life and new civilizations. In doing so, created a stage upon which ethical questions, questions about the nature and future of humanity, questions about what might lay beyond, were able to be explored. Its creator, Gene Roddenberry, rejected Christian faith as a teenager and seemed to have vaguely defined pantheistic personal beliefs. There were no Christian characters, indeed no openly religious characters at all among the crew of the Enterprise. 300 years into our future, it was assumed that humanity would have moved beyond all that. On the surface, the series was a celebration of secular humanism. Yet themes relating to religion and spirituality were never far from the surface. Whether intended or not, questions of God, human sinfulness, messianic figures, and forgiveness popped up regularly. Ironically, perhaps, it seemed that even an imagined scientific and secular future that was semi-utopian could not simply be done with fundamentally religious questions. So how might we explain this odd relationship of religion in a fictional world in which it is supposedly being superseded? One explanation that has been put forward is that the completely secular world, which is portrayed in the original Star Trek series and similar science fiction stories, is not as anti-religious as they seem. Orson Scott Card, an award-winning American science fiction writer and practicing Mormon, observed, when a science fiction writer shows humanity evolving beyond the need for religion, the belief system and the culture they depict as being higher than religion will most likely be precisely their own present religion, by which Card meant secular anti-religious conviction. The religious void that seems so palpable in much science fiction is, as Card suggests, perhaps no void at all. While some have argued that the absence of obvious religious elements in much science fiction is because there is simply no place for it, it could be argued that quite the opposite is the case. Albert Bergeson and Andrew Greeley observed that what science fiction does is to naturalize extraordinary occurrences, turning potential grace experiences into science-like puzzles, where the normal reaction is to search for a solution rather than be awestruck and suspect the presence of the divine. In other words, what science fiction does is to debunk what might normally be taken as religious or supernatural occurrence, but it often does so with almost pseudo-religious conviction. Hence, science fiction, as McKee explains, often becomes itself a form of faith that seeks to help us understand not only who we are, but who we will become. So those are just a couple basic approaches and categories, and you can think of, I'm sure each of you, a lot more that you might fit in those that would tend to have a negative, not so optimistic view about the role of religion in a utopian or semi-utopian scientific future. Our next model looks at some more positive approaches to religion. So model number 3, religion is not the same as science, but is positively integrated into advanced future societies. And this model corresponds roughly to Barber's dialogue model. Science and religion are both recognized, and they interact within the imagined world more or less positively. This view occurs especially, I've noted, among explicitly Christian writers and those of some other religions who are writing to show that religion and science, when both at their best, can work together and complement one another. Madeleine Engel's Time Quintet, which begins with her classic A Wrinkle in Time, is an example of this model with its overt Christian imagery and message. Though this is seen as being moderated by the Engel's liberal brand of Christianity, which makes room for other religious perspectives and sees not just Jesus fighting the evil black cloud threatening various worlds, but adds others who have joined the battle throughout history, including Euclid, Gandhi, and the Buddha. Another intriguing example, and some of you might have read this, is Walter Miller's A Canticle for Leibowitz. The novel actually begins with a dystopian world, which I've tried to avoid in this survey, but it moves back toward a world impacted positively by science and light, but with the help of organized religion, in this case, the Roman Catholic Church. Its positive portrayal of organized religion in an otherwise bleak world and the role that it plays in helping the world recover from a nuclear apocalypse stands in stark contrast to the usual portrayal of the church in science fiction. Another overtly Christian example that fits in this model is the Emissary of the Oppressed trilogy by Australian author Ian Miller, in which atheist scientist Timothy Martin finds his way onto other planets and discovers societies advanced in their own ways, but experiencing very real battles of good and evil in ways which force him to consider that there may be something spiritual and even divine at work. While most books in this category are not well known, this is not universally the case. The early science fiction classic Dune by Frank Herbert, first published in 1965, so early by our standards now, I guess, is a story in which science and faith are thoroughly integrated in often strange and unexpected ways. Religious beliefs and religions can be both good and bad in the story, but they are not belittled or seen as unimportant or simply false. The religion of the Bene Gesserit is key to the storyline. And instead of religion's ultimate demise, Herbert portrays a future unification of religions with his famous Orange Catholic Bible, as well as the unlikely construct religions like Buddhism, Mahayana Christianity, and my personal favorite, Zen Sunni Catholicism. And just to show that the development of these great religious amalgamations was realistic, in line with the real world history of much religious conflict, he notes in an appendix that the production of the Orange Catholic Bible, which he does explain in some detail, not only cost the lives of most of the people who worked in the committee who produced it, but produced a series of riots that claimed 80 million lives in its aftermath. So came at a price. So it's a bit of crossover in Dune with conflict models, but the significant difference is that the religions are not fighting against science and technology, but they're fighting against each other. So Dune is an interesting one. Number 4, in the final model we want to consider, religion and science turn out to be the same thing. Religious views were basically right, if limited in their understanding, and science is only catching up. This model, I believe, parallels Barber's integration model, but it's adapted to science fiction. In the real world of science and religion, integration is manifest in unified or even unitary worldviews in which science and religion heavily inform one another. In science fiction, it is more often manifest in the revelation that religion and science often turn out to be the same thing, mostly with religion being found to have been formed by those not fully understanding the scientific and technological explanations behind their religious beliefs. So let me illustrate how this works, and it comes up more often than you might expect. A current and popular example of this model can be found in the Marvel comic movies and the Marvel universe. Here, for instance, Thor and the other Norse gods turn out to be very real. We just didn't understand their technology or that they come from other worlds. In these stories, science does not replace religion, but explains it or makes sense of it. For some, this might be simply another, though perhaps unexpected, form of science conquering religion. But importantly, in these stories, religion is not replaced or denied, and its adherence not denigrated. And while we're thinking of comic book science fiction, we can overlook the long-running Superman comics and movies. Here we have a powerful savior figure who, especially in the film series, takes on increasingly obvious parallels to Jesus. But his divine-like powers are not explained as supernatural. There is a scientific explanation. He's from another planet and of a different species. On Krypton, Kal-El would be normal. On Earth, he comes across as a god. But the point is that he's not a god. He does not require or accept worship because there is a scientific and rational explanation for his existence and his powers. Another branch of the model of religion and science turn out to be the same thing can be seen in those stories which portray a future scientifically advanced world which affirms the ultimate reality or truth of a particular religion, usually the religion embraced by the writer. An early and classic example of this is the sci-fi trilogy of C.S. Lewis. In the first book of the series, Out of the Silent Planet from 1938, it is revealed that what the pagan religion saw as gods and even planets, and what Christians identify as angels, are actually beings of light called Eldila who live in interplanetary blank space. Another take on this model is found in Canadian author Jessica Pegas, the God Painter. Here, inhabitants of Earth are saved from the impending destruction of the planet by a massive solar flare by aliens with unbelievably advanced technology who load them almost instantaneously into massive spaceships and take them to another planet, which is uninhabited, while still further remarkable technology allows the rebuilding of something closely resembling the world and cities they left behind. But the transported humans' relief at being rescued soon turns to suspicion. Who are these alien beings? Only 5 of whom are present with them on their new planetary home. The Catholic Church, operating from a technologically recreated Rome, begins a special series of investigations, particularly worried about the lack of clarity concerning the gender and sexuality of these beings and the influence this could have on human thinking about sexuality and gender. The slow reveal as the novel builds leads not to the discovery of some sinister alien plot, but to the reality that these beings are what humans have traditionally called angels. They answer ultimately to God, and super advanced technology is simply how they work. Faith and belief is confirmed, but is understood not in terms of magic or the supernatural, but of a technology far superior to our own. Still another way to achieve this meshing of science and religion is seen in Morton Benning's Playing God. Benning portrays a world in which religious faith is earnestly observed by its main character, Keenly, who is a novice training for the priesthood within his religion. But it turns out that his religion, like himself, exists only as the construct of a sophisticated, futuristic video game being played by a spoiled and self-centered teenager who has placed himself in the role of God within the game. So it appears the beginning of the novel to be supernatural has a cyberspace explanation. The Star Wars franchise of movies also fits into this model of religion and science, blending as one. The Force is perhaps the best known of science fiction built religions. It even has a following of sorts in the real world, in which for every census, tens of thousands of people list Jedi as their religion. The Force itself is explained in the films, or in the fourth film, by the existence of midichlorians, which occur in concentrations in some beings and seem to be passed on hereditarily, as with the Skywalker family. These minute particles can be observed through testing and seem to work together to achieve a balance in the Force. Now, originally, in explaining how the Force worked, George Lucas talked about being able to work for it, had to be sensitive to it, anyone can gain it. It looked a bit like magic. But by the time he gets to the second series of movies, he had moved toward a much more scientific, naturalistic explanation and wrote, midichlorians are a race that everybody knows about in the world of Star Wars. The way you interact and interface with this larger energy field, the Force, is through the midichlorians, which are sensitive to energy. They are at the core of your life, which is in each individual cell, each living cell. They are in a symbiotic relationship with the cell, and then, because they're all interconnected as one, they can communicate with the larger force field. That's how you deal with the Force. So religion of Star Wars is revealed finally in the fourth film, now known as Episode 1, The Phantom Menace, is not a supernatural force as many originally supposed, but is explained by scientifically verifiable forces, testable forces within the natural world. Similarly, the movie Avatar, and with new films about to appear in this franchise, it will become more significant, also falls into this category. The apparently simple peoples of the planet Pandora, like most simple societies, have strong religious beliefs. In contrast, the newcomers from Earth who are exploiting their planet show no signs of religious belief or practice, but often disparage that of the local inhabitants. In the end, even seek to destroy the main symbol of their religion. Yet the local religion is ultimately shown not to be mere wishful thinking, but a reality. It is not a supernatural reality, however, but rather a natural occurring reality on that planet that the newcomers from Earth have simply failed to understand. Even Star Trek, the great purveyor of a future in which religion fades and technology and freedom advance, eventually contributed to this category in Deep Space Nine with the Bajoran religion, which the series portrays mostly seriously, though its religious hierarchy is often viewed with suspicion and portrayed as controlling. Yet Bajor's religious leaders end up building an unlikely link with the science station DS9 when they proclaim the station's leader, Benjamin Sisko, as the emissary of the prophets, or something akin to their Messiah. It is finally revealed that the religion's famous prophets are based not on creative imagination, but on real voices of advanced beings living in a nearby wormhole. As Bajoran Kira explains to the reluctant emissary Sisko in the episode called Destiny, the prophets, the aliens that live in the wormhole, as you like to call them, exist outside of linear time. They know past, present, and future. They communicated knowledge of the future And now, 3,000 years later, we are seeing these events unfold. To me, that reasoning sounds concrete. Science and religion have become one. As varied as these examples are, they share a broadly common understanding of science and religion. Religious faith is not falsified, denigrated, or doomed to fade away. It is, however, understood through the lens of science. The superstition is taken out of religion, if not the power. It is, for the world of science fiction, perhaps the ultimate integration of science and religion. So, some conclusions. The stories we tell about imagined worlds are important with regard to our understanding of the present science and faith relationship for two reasons. Firstly, science fiction writers, going back at least to Jules Verne, have always been regarded as among our best futurists. Even the oddest and most improbable worlds and futures they create are at some level extrapolations from the expectations, including both the hopes and the fears, that we have for the future based upon our present state of knowledge and experience of the world. This is particularly true of writers who set their stories in Earth's own future. But we see it in also stories set in alternative reality, Earths and in other worlds, as these two are necessarily based upon the experiences and the basic scientific knowledge gathered and formed by writers living upon this Earth. The futurist function of science fiction writers is described well by Gabriel McKee, who explains that by creating imagined alternate worlds, science fiction authors hold up a mirror to our time, sometimes amplifying its best aspects, sometimes warning us of its worst. In all cases, the goal of science fiction is to use its imaginary worlds to create a real world of the future that is better than our present. When science fiction writers create a role and place for religion in their worlds, or deliberately avoid it, this has significance as we consider the projections of these writers as futurists, and as we ask why and how these scenarios are arrived at. How might these stories, in providing both warnings and hope, help us to move to a more positive and fruitful relationship, for instance, between science and religion? Of course, some writers will have thought these matters through more than others, and some stories will reflect this more constructively than others. But to some extent, this futurist aspect is always present in science fiction. The other reason that science fiction is important for understanding of the present science and faith relationship is that it is a very powerful force shaping popular attitudes and expectations. Today's leading scientists were heavily influenced in the youth by television series such as Star Trek, movies such as Star Wars, and books such as Dune. And I think almost in every significant interview I've listened to with famous scientists and philosophical thinkers, asking them what got them started, they start talking back when they were a child, watching these movies, watching these shows, and they have an impact. These stories stretched their imaginations and ours, helped them to envision the kind of world they wanted to help bring about, or the kind of world they wanted to avoid. The popular science fiction stories of our present generation will necessarily have a similar impact. If we want to see where the attitudes and expectations of tomorrow's scientists and leading thinkers will be with regard to something like the role of science and religion, then we should not rely solely on reading the latest essays on philosophy of science and religion, but we should be looking carefully at currently popular and influential science fiction as well. As academics involved in the science and faith dialogue, it's all too easy to simply read and respond to other academics, to engage only one another in discussions about the role of religion and faith in an increasingly science and technology dominated world. But we are in danger of overlooking, if we do this, or of dismissing as mere entertainment, one of the biggest influences on these attitudes, namely the way religion and faith are portrayed in popular science fiction. And there's justification here for stressing the word popular. With regard to the observations of futurists, of creative portrayals of science and faith, some of the most interesting material is often to be found among relatively obscure writers. But when we turn our attention to the influence of science fiction on the attitudes of current and emerging generations of thinkers, we necessarily focused on the most popular books, and especially the most popular movies and television series. We look for those stories that are generating memes, that are appearing on t-shirts, that are popping up as allusions in casual conversations. In this regard, it's important for me as a keen reader and viewer of science fiction to set aside some of my own preferences and prejudices and give attention to the shows trending on streaming services, to the blockbuster movies, and to the books bursting the shelves of young adult sections of my local bookstore. We do not need to be futurist to realize that science fiction of today will provide critical insight into the views of science, including its relationship, religion, and faith in emerging generations. And I hope that the model I put forward, adapted and expanded from Barbara's four models, might help provide some sort of construct that we can use to analyze and categorize the ever-expanding field of science fiction that we find in graphic novels, comic books, streaming services, movies, novellas, etc. Thank you very much for your attention. I think that was the 40 minutes I was given. Neil?
Thank you, Mark. That was well timed and fascinating. I must say, though I had a misspent youth reading science fiction, I haven't done as much reading, particularly new stuff, as I would like. And it brought back many memories, and still a few favourites of mine that I might raise in question time. But first, I'll hand it over to Glen for his response to your paper. Thank you very much, Glen.
Thank you, Neil, and thank you, Mark, for your presentation. Just a word about myself. I am employed by the Salvation Army, but I am a Uniting Church minister, and my role at Eva Burrows College, which is one of the colleges of the University of Divinity, is as research coordinator. At EBC, along with my colleague, Dr. Arseny Ermakov, we have developed 3 units on futurism and theology, one of which is Imagined Futures in Popular Culture, which takes utopian and dystopian fiction and film and gaming and brings it into dialogue with Christian eschatology. Theologically, I do most of my work in the Wesleyan space, but with a very deep commitment to ecumenical thought and activity. So I'm coming to you from the land of the Wurundjeri people in the northeast of Melbourne, in the beautiful Plenty Valley, the land of the River Red Gums. And I would just like to add my word of recognition also to First Nations people who are the owners and custodians of these lands upon which we all work. I want to thank Mark for his fascinating survey of the relationship between science and religion in science fiction. My comments will not be as sharply focused on the science and religion relationship. Instead, I will briefly consider how religion itself, and Christianity in particular, or at least remnants of Christianity, is portrayed in some of the future worlds portrayed by science fiction writers. The non-survival of at least conventional Christianity in science fiction is perhaps unsurprising. First, because the Christian faith has been subject to significant change over development over time, and science fiction is a form of futurism. Second, because the best known authors of what we might consider the classic period of the mid-20th century, Isaac Asimov, Robert Heinlein, Arthur C. Clarke et al., were secular humanists who held an evolutionary view of religion as something which had had its day and would be superseded by science. Arthur C. Clarke's famous statement that any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic could easily be extended to religion. Science could better explain all that religion had earlier claimed to explain in its more primitive fashion. Nonetheless, as Mark has pointed out, the absence of religious themes does not necessarily mean antipathy toward religion on the part of the author. Atheist writers have often found religion to be a narratively rich theme. Isaac Asimov, who was Jewish but not religiously so, was able to write in 1995 that though he tended to, quote, ignore religion in my own stories altogether, except when I absolutely have to, whenever I bring in a religious motif, that religion is bound to seem vaguely Christian, because that is the only religion I know anything about, even though it is not my own. An unsympathetic reader might think that I am burlesquing Christianity, but I am not. Then too, it is impossible to write science fiction and really ignore religion, close quote. And Mark has already given a rich set of examples from science fiction, so that nothing is really lacking from his analysis. I would still enjoy, however, offering a few examples of my own about the futures of religion and the religions of the future. In the television series Battlestar Galactica, 2004 to 2010, the human survivors of Earth have adopted a polytheistic belief in the Olympian gods and goddesses, in whose hands their fate is held. It is their military enemies, the artificially intelligent Cylons, who adhere to belief in one god alone. When the human character Gaius Baltar adopts this belief, he becomes a prophet who gathers disciples into a new cult. Their monotheistic belief in a single god who creates, loves, and cares for all humans and Cylons alike becomes the basis of forging a peace between the warring species. This is not Christianity, of course, but it is an interesting anticipation of a revival of monotheism, but not among humans, rather on the part of artificial intelligence. Similarly, in the film Blade Runner 2049, 2017, directed by Denis Villeneuve, while the humans have seemingly surrendered to consumerism and hedonism in a post-apocalyptic global warming scenario, the replicants have begun to ask philosophical questions about the meaning of their own existence. In the post-human world, when artificial intelligence develops a soul as well as the capacity to reproduce, and all humans are left to pursue is their own narcissistic pleasures, it is left to the replicants to pursue a higher ideal, their own self-determination and freedom. Of course, the technocrats want to control this development for their own self-aggrandizing ends and care nothing for questions of the soul. Instead, they take a utilitarian view of replicants as an underclass to be exploited for their labor and weaponized. If it is the case that religious instincts are part and parcel of the phenomenon of consciousness, it should not surprise us if increasingly sophisticated AI might be expected to develop such instincts. Of course, the nearness of this eventuality is highly overstated, given the technical problems to be overcome and the unreproducible complexity of the human brain/mind/soul. Frank Herbert's 1965 novel Dune won both the Hugo and Nebula Awards in 1966, after having been serialized in the pulp magazine Analog. Mark places Dune into his third category of future worlds where religion and science seamlessly coexist. It includes, along with its 5 sequels, one of the most sophisticated and detailed religious worlds in science fiction. A messianic tale, it involves a jihad against computers and robots, and the feel of Dune is more Islamic than it is Christian, with its Arabic loanwords and its setting on a desert planet. Paul Atreides has been compared to T.E. Lawrence in his role as a foreign deliverer of a tribal people. Herbert was also heavily influenced by ideas in Zen Buddhism. And Dune has been said to be a response to Asimov's Foundation series, which follows the broad outline of Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, with its now outmoded claim that Christianity caused the end of the empire by demasculinizing it from within. In a 1980 interview with Omni magazine, Herbert referred to Paul Atreides' gift of prescience as, quote, the Presbyterian fixation involving a web of predestination, which negates surprises and sets up a mathematically enclosed universe. The way that the religious texts function in Dune is effectively traced in the quotations at the start of each chapter of the novel. We read quotations from the pillars of the universe and from the collected sayings and family commentaries of Muad'Dib being the messianic figure Paul Atreides. In Appendix 2 of Dune, Herbert provides a helpful essay on the religion of Dune, in which one finds reference to several Christian words and ideas. The Bible is referenced along the source text of the religion of the Fremen of Arrakis. The hymn to water is drawn from the Orange Catholic Liturgical Manual, and the followers of the 14 sages, whose sacred text was known as the Orange Catholic Bible. This Bible had given rise to commentaries and other literature produced by the Commission of Ecumenical Translators. Among the several religious movements that had given rise to the so-called ancient teachings is included the Nava Christianity of Chusuk. Of course, Herbert is having fun playing with words here, attempting to fill out his imaginative world with such inventive sketches, tantalizing us with the possibilities of religious futures. More than anything else, it was space exploration which transmuted religion in the Dune universe. The vastness of the universe gave a different flavour and sense to the idea of creation that led to the highest of religious achievements. Quote, all through religion, the feeling of the sacred was touched by anarchy from the outer dark, close quote. The gendered elements of religion were also impacted by this new awareness, feminizing religion's impulses. Quote, it was as though Jupiter, in all his descendant forms, retreated into the maternal darkness to be superseded by a female immanence filled with ambiguity and with a face of many terrors, close quote. The Bene Gesserit tapped into this power, making them a feared cohort of sorceresses. In this new universe, Genesis was reinterpreted to involve dominion, not just over Earth, but all existing worlds. Herbert asserts that all religions had sprung from the old Earth and recounted how the Commission of Ecumenical Translators had met there upon Earth and identified a single core commandment, thou shalt not disfigure the soul. They asserted that the universe possessed a divine essence and rejected the claim that any one religion could possess a single unique revelation. The Commission laboured for many years to produce a single religious text that would eliminate all the pathological symptoms of the religious past, describing it as an instrument of love to be played in all ways. The final product was the Orange Catholic Bible and its accompanying liturgical manual and commentaries. The Prophet Muad'Dib's own teachings, including the commentaries contained in the Pillars of the Universe, were heavily reliant on the Orange Catholic Bible. No sooner had it appeared, however, than it was denounced as full of errors, proving unable to smooth away the competing claims of diverse religious cults. So let me try on a little interesting thought experiment. Imagine, if you will, place yourself in an earlier Christian era, let's say in 384, around the time that Jerome's Latin Vulgate appeared. Imagine you were told that in 300 years' time, a new religion would emerge that would blend characters, events, and ideas from the Hebrew and Christian scriptures, that would be built on the teachings of a desert prophet who claimed a new revelation from God, authoritatively enshrined in a new sacred scripture that superseded all others as a full and final revelation from God, and that this new religion would last more than 1400 years. It's easy to see, perhaps, how to a 4th century Byzantine or Catholic Christian, the emergence of Islam might seem science fiction. This historical thought experiment may help us consider the possibilities of future religions and perhaps future Christianities. These are bounded in science fiction by the imaginations, presuppositions, biases, and ideological commitments of authors. The actual future of Christianity is not so circumscribed, but remains open to the many possibilities to be found in the interaction between divine and human action and reaction. It is a more certain future because it is anchored in the promise that all things in the universe will find their culmination and their perfection in Jesus Christ. Christianity as an idea or as an institution may one day be replaced by other religious expressions. The difficulty of us imagining such a development is constrained, if we are Christians, by our insider status within Christianity, as well as by the Church's endurance over 2 millennia. This 2,000-year period makes Christianity seem ancient. In the scope of time envisioned by science fiction writers, let alone in the mind of the infinite God, 2 millennia is but a passing day. Whatever the future of Christianity might be, Christ as the cosmic center of existence can never be superseded, for in him, according to Colossians 1:17, all things hold together. Though religion and science have often been framed in an adversarial way, they have always been fruitfully connected to each other. They have, if you like, grown up together. There is no reason to think that they will not continue to accompany each other into the far-off future. The images produced by the James Webb Space Telescope have provoked an almost religious awe as the vastness and beauty of yet to be uncovered worlds are open to us. The exploration of this universe and whatever other universes there may be will see religious instincts and scientific research experience perhaps a greater convergence than ever. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Glenn. I'd suggest we just take a 5-minute break. But anyway, thank you very much for both those presentations. Yes, Robert.
Thank you, Neil, and thanks very much, Mark and Glenn, for those very interesting papers. Recently, I've been doing some work on Romano Guardini, the German theologian of Italian heritage. And Guardini, in his books about science, technology, and power in the modern world, at one stage says, well, humanity has power, but it doesn't yet have power over its own power. And he writes a lot of interesting things about the need for wisdom in relation to our technological power. And at a time when nuclear war is being threatened and climate change and so on, I find his thought very helpful and apposite. So my question is, are there forms of science fiction or key works in science fiction that see religion as a source of wisdom in relation to our technological power, whether for restraint or guidance or channeling or whatever that might be? Thank you.
That's interesting. I thought a couple stories. So I thought, no, that's fantasy. It's not science fiction. But that would be a very positive role for religion. You go to religious leaders to ask for insight and advice. And I'm trying to think where we would find that. They usually tend to go to the scientist, to the action leader. So I'm sure it's out there. Neil, can you think of any off the top of your head? I'm sure there's some there. As soon as you say it, I'll think of it, but it's not jumping out at me at the moment.
No, it's not jumping out at me.
Which is interesting that it's not, because maybe science fiction writers tend to say when you're looking at how do we master and use this power that's going to overrun us, you don't go and ask the local spiritual guru. They're looking for the person that understands the science and the technology and how it works, rather than trying to understand the human soul.
Thank you, Robert. Now we have another question, another hand up there.
Yes, I'm Johanni Tuovinen. I think Mark might know me from way back. And my area is education and as well as science. I'm really interested in the fact that if there isn't a lot of literature that really explores the integration model of science and faith, why don't we encourage it? I'll put a comment on the chat there a moment ago about having a competition in that area. So what do you think about that, Mark?
Anything to encourage, I think, writers with positive views to put them out there. In many ways, fiction writing, especially things that engage popular culture like science fiction, it is the meeting place of ideas of our day. This is where we go for the marketplace to share ideas and concerns, and our voices need to be in there. And if we're trying to say we want to put forth a specifically Christian worldview and one that's not anti-science, then let's put forward some models on how that can work. And some have tried that, like Martin Hewitt is well known and doing some stuff cooperatively with Ted Peters and others on science and faith projects. And he does a bit of novel writing in his spare time. And so he wrote a novel about Jesus being cloned, in trying to integrate all these complex conversations about science and faith to model that. So it's well worth encouraging. A lot of the integration we have now is more the models. The science fiction version of it seems to be how science explains faith, and so that's a way of understanding it, but not really the kind of integration that Barber had imagined his model. That's a little bit harder to find. It would be interesting to see if people could do more for that. I'm sure if you put up some funding or money, we would find people entering the competition, Johanni.
Yeah.
Perhaps this cast.
Yeah, what I was thinking is that here's a whole range of possible options and directions to go in. It doesn't have to sort of necessarily constrain anything. Rather, it would be some way of opening people's minds up and saying, okay, well, we've always been told about the conflict model or assumed the conflict model. Okay, how about if we take the integration model? How would that work?
Yeah, it'd be nice to see more positive models of how science and faith relate. And if people are being heavily influenced by fiction, especially science fiction, it's a natural place for this discussion to take place. And it'd be great to foster that kind of dialogue and encouragement in people getting their voices in.
Frank.
I've got a two-part question. Science fiction has introduced us to a whole new vocabulary and ways of thinking about faith and the Christian, let's take it from a Christian perspective, and some of our deepestly held beliefs. And I'm reminded of an essay question that the Australian College of Theology put out in about 1981. And the question was, roughly, given the revelations or given the information provided by astrophysics, what can be said of the resurrection? Which at the time I was very, very angry with, but I appreciate the question a lot more now. So I guess the two-part question is, do you actually see that, any link or any benefit or value from the language that science offers us, the insights into creation and the vocabulary that goes around that, and the way we might articulate Christian doctrine? And if so, what might you see to be some of the challenges to orthodox expression of faith?
You're talking about the language science offers us or science fiction?
Well, science fiction uses a lot of language from science.
It does, but it also creates its own categories and terms. Science per se is rather restricted and operates from a kind of functional naturalistic basis on just what we can see and test, which makes it a bit difficult using only that language to talk about things like resurrection, eternal life, that which is difficult. In science fiction, we often go beyond these categories, and sometimes science fiction can provide opportunities, ways, and models for talking about things that are scientifically comprehensible, but that also go beyond that, because science fiction often likes to go beyond what we can actually see and test, to surprise us, so that the supernatural element can easily come in there.
Yeah, I guess I'm thinking in terms of things like the force be with you. Okay, well, maybe the question's not an easy question to respond to.
Yeah, well, that's again from science fiction, not from science, because science doesn't know anything about a universal force that we can tap into that's seeking balance in the universe. But in science fiction, they're saying, hey, we have a scientific world here, but we're trying to imagine a world that's exclusively scientific, but that also has some sort of force that's seeking balance. There's some sort of power out there that we can rely on that can aid and help us. And that gets into distinctively religious realm, and gives a construct for talking about that. For some people, saying the force be with you is kind of the modern scientific replacement for God be with you, whatever the force is. So do we redefine God as to just be the force? It's rather, it's impersonal. The force doesn't, and maybe that's what modern scientific people want. They want something. There's a desire there to have something beyond us, but they don't want something that wants any kind of commitment. The force never expects anything from anyone. It never excommunicates anyone. It never has any orthodoxy or heresy trials. It's just simply there seeking balance, and maybe that's the kind of God we want. Something there, but that just doesn't intervene or interfere. And that's fascinating that people have taken so much to this idea of the force be with you and the Jedi religion. There's an impulse to want religion, but they like a religion that just doesn't really have any specific hard and fast expectations, rules, regulations. It's a very impersonal force, but people are happy for something to be there.
Yeah, if I can just take it a little bit longer, absolutely what you say is true. I'm just mindful that our paradigm of creation has shifted from a three-tiered universe to a cosmic universe. And our language around God, for many, I think suits a three-tiered universe quite well. Doesn't necessarily treat a cosmic understanding of trillions and trillions of stars and planets and all the potential that has there. So the concept of the force as something which pervades absolutely everything, as distinct from a language which describes God on a throne in heaven, just up there. I'm just wondering, in terms of conveying a Christian understanding of faith, how that might or might not be used from within the faith community to talk to people who are outside of it.
A lot of Christian science fiction writers have tried to do this. That sometimes explicitly Christian writers have talked about imagining worlds within our galaxy, even in other galaxies, in a far distant future, very different from our own, in which there's also God, even some sort of form of Christ, and how that works to help us imagine a God that goes beyond, you know, our kind of old three-tiered universe that we'd always imagined, very limited from our scope. And so it helps. I think science fiction writing can also be used to help expand us to see the possibilities and say, oh, this could be seen from a perspective outside of what we're setting right now. And I know a number of series do that. I think C.S. Lewis tried to do that just in going outside, you know, the planets of the solar system. Other Christian writers have tried to go further than that and look at how God and Christianity might look in entirely different species, entirely different beings, entirely different planes, a God that's much more cosmic, as you said.
I might invite Glen to join this.
Yes, Glen, help me up here.
Thanks, Neil. In one of John Wesley's sermons with the title, What is Man? He's got two sermons with the same title. He asks the question of whether there is life on other planets within our solar system, which of course is one of the key themes within science fiction, the concept, the positing of life, intelligent life on other planets, and even whole civilizations and empires. And it's really fascinating the way he discusses this, because on the one hand, he's got a theological argument about the priority of human beings as the only creatures made in the image of God. And therefore that there's no life on other planets because all the action is here on Earth and the drama of salvation has been played out here on planet Earth. He actually began with the belief that there was life on other planets and then swung to the opposite conclusion, but not just on a theological basis. He studied the writings of the Dutch mathematician Christian Huygens about the solar and lunar eclipses. And Huygens's conclusion was that there could not be life, that life could not be sustainable on the other planets within our solar system. Don't ask me to explain the science behind it all. But Wesley read all of that stuff and then came back with his conclusion that there was no life on other planets. We are it. But the interesting thing for me is that the theological observations about humanity made in the image of God, therefore being privileged, and the scientific explorations of his day, well, Huygens was a little earlier. He was, I think, a late 17th century figure. But, you know, the prevailing scientific views of the day on that question were given equal balance, equal weight in his consideration of that question about whether there is life on other planets. So I think that that's a good example of how there is no ultimate incompatibility between scientific research and conclusions. Of course, all scientific theories are subject to testing and subject to change, but then so also are theological ideas subject to testing and subject to change over time. But when those things are done in tandem, there's no necessary disjunction between scientific and theological exploration of any given question.
Yeah, thanks, Glenn. That's interesting. One of the things that many people don't realize in the 17th and 18th centuries, this discussion about whether there's life on other planets was a very real discussion. And while some like Wesley decided no, others decided yes, they were happy to entertain it. They could visualize it. The idea that life that God cared about could only exist on Earth is much more recent. That's something we became fixated with for all sorts of interesting reasons more recently. But if you go back further in time, this is a wide-ranging discussion that included a number of theological thinkers that didn't have a problem with conceptualizing that there could be other life forms that God cared about and was salvifically involved with. And I think in some ways our minds closed a bit in the 19th and 20th centuries, late 19th and 20th century on some of these matters for all sorts of reasons as we began thinking all these scientific type discussions were a threat to Christianity. But in the 17th and 18th centuries, there were a surprising number of Christian thinkers who were possibly predisposed to considering that God had created other life forms on other planets, usually in our solar system, because that's the ones they knew about, and even discussions about how he might relate to them and what life was like in these planets. And that just kind of disappeared and not only was forgotten, we developed an atmosphere and attitude which many Christian thinkers were suggesting that it was inconceivable that God could have any creatures that he loved apart from those on this earth, of which there's never any theological biblical basis for that assumption. So those ideas got banned from the real world discussions of theologians in the church to science fiction.
Brendan.
Thank you to both Mark and Glenn for your presentations. To just introduce myself, my name is Brendan Byrne. No, not that one. I'm a Uniting Church minister and a colleague of Glen's. And as Glenn knows, I am a big fan of anime, and particularly of the cyberpunk genre within anime. And this is a field that the anime genre has explored extensively through, classic series and features such as Akira and Ghost in the Shell and Psycho Pass, and even the recent Cyberpunk Edge Runners series that was released on Netflix and is doing gangbusters. I was drawn to this particular presentation because of the title, Religiously Human in a Techno-Scientific World. And one of the great issues that I think the cyberpunk genre explores is, what does it mean to be human? In a context in which the physical human person is augmented or even transformed by technology. And a recurring theme through the cyberpunk genre is the struggle of the protagonist to retain a sense of their human identity, notwithstanding the transformation of their physical selves, and the struggle to retain human relationships and connections that are distinctly identifiable as human. And yet it seems that despite the fact that many of these programs and shows are replete with philosophical references and even theological references. I mean, that's the title of that iconic series, Neon Genesis Evangelion, just says it all. The struggle for human identity occurs exclusively in secular terms, exclusively in non-religious terms, because the programs often occur in dystopic contexts in which religion, as we might understand it today, has decayed with society itself and has been replaced by rather malevolent cultic practices. So given the title of this paper, and given that cyberpunk seems to articulate the struggle to be human in secular terms, is it the case that science fiction or particular forms of science fiction can't conceptualize or conceive what it might mean to be religiously human in a post-human or transformed human state? Or is it the case that religion as we live and experience it now can't conceive what it might mean to be human in a transhuman, post-human context? And how do we reconcile those two? How do we form a bridge between those two? Because as I said, one of the anomalies, it seems to me, of the cyberpunk genre is that it expresses itself through all these philosophical and theological references, but the ultimate struggle is one that's done in secular terms.
Yeah, I suppose I've always wondered why there's not more philosophical religious analysis of some of the anime cyberpunk, because anyone that's seen, Ghost in the Shell, Akira, many of these, it's just so much there about what it means to be human, about soul. There's so many questions that are raised. And I don't know if the audience didn't seem to be broad enough. Certainly a lot of people, maybe the generation that's grown up and that hasn't yet come to age enough that they're all now holding chairs of philosophy in various departments and writing, books about this for the students to read and being influenced by it. We're still going through the Star Trek generation that grew up with that. I don't know if I agree that Christianity or something that we're not capable of thinking in these ways and asking these questions about what it means to be human. When you start doing things like combining humanity with technology, some science fiction does explore this a little bit. The question of the Borg is very interesting. How much is lost before something ceases to be human? Can that be reclaimed? Can you be human and still be part of the collective? Do you have to be unplugged first? It comes up in many places in traditional science fiction, but it does seem to be a particular obsession with anime, whether it has to do with the Japanese culture that produced a lot of this originally, why the particular kind of secular basis that takes place. But I think they're very valid questions for the church in theology, and can engage and use these stories as a platform to begin engaging them. And I have to admit, I've wondered in the past why it hasn't happened more. Maybe it's waiting for Brennan for you to write the book and get it started. I'm sure the book's out there in articles, but it's not. It's probably not as prevalent, the discussion, as one would think when one sees these things and looks at what they're discussing and says, these are good questions. We need, as Christians, we need to be involved in this debate. Why aren't we? Glenn, what would your response be?
I wonder whether Sandra God might have something to say. I know that she's published in the area of Christian transhumanism, questions about posthuman and transhuman futures. So I don't want to put you on the spot, Sandra, but I would certainly
just did.
comment from you. But yeah, Christian transhumanism, I think, does reflect on these kinds of questions, but sometimes from a rather kind of naive way. There are Christian transhumanists, but I think they buy into a kind of evolutionary view of humanity that is in some ways sort of problematic. They sort of, they also tend to accept sort of the dualism inherent in the idea of the distinction between the body and the soul. So the whole idea of a mind upload, for example, you could take your mind or your soul or whatever and put it into a computer. That presupposes that a person has these separable qualities known as the body and the mind, that these things that could be separated. But of course, in theological anthropology, that whole sort of concept has been, has come under some scrutiny. Does it owe itself more to Platonic ideas than to authentically Christian ones? And is it possible to be a person without a body at all? Or are we not all embodied creatures? So, yeah. Anyway, I don't know. Sandra, would you want to say anything? You don't have to.
If Sandra would like to, that'd be good. I should point out Vicky Lorimer, who will be one of our speakers in the future, has written a book on transhumanism and will be one of our speakers.
Yeah, and it's another theme that comes up in some science fiction. Science fiction is a wonderful platform because things that you don't have an audience for, or that you're afraid to discuss, you might not be able to bring about within the realm of the science you work in, or particularly within the church, you can bring up in science fiction. And raise these questions in its various forms, and certainly, a lot of the cyberpunk anime certainly is on that broader fringe of what we call science fiction or movement, and interesting discussions develop. So it's just such a wonderful platform to discuss these things. But I don't think we've been particularly good at then translating them back into mainstream philosophical and theological discussions and making use of them. And even sometimes we see it. I know a lot of good Christian thinkers who went and seen brilliant movies. I know a couple of theologians who went and saw The Matrix, the first show, and said that was absolutely fascinating. Said, well, what did you think about the Jesus imagery in there? And they just looked at me blankly because they just went expecting entertainment, not expecting to find some deeply thought through philosophical, questions and imagery, and miss that. So I think sometimes we just don't open our eyes to discussions around us, and we're not joining in. And what Brennan brought up was one of those issues where I think, yeah, we could be joining in doing more. It's a fascinating discussion, but it's not a mainstream one within the Christian church at all. And even the wider society, you get a few puzzled looks to understand what it means transhuman. People aware of it within the Christian church. Maybe we're afraid to go there. I know it does exist. There's some interesting discussions, but sometimes it's safer to bring it up in the realm of science fiction or anime.
And I see my friend and colleague Doru has his hand up, but before I go to Doru, I would use the chair's opportunity to ask a question or at least make a comment, if I may. Look, one of the novels that I did read and struck me, like in terms of the sort of 4 different types, doesn't quite fit, I don't think, in terms of what the author does. And it's one of Greg Bear's books on the Darwin's Children, I think it's called. but it's just one of the characters has, well, one of the central characters who's a scientist, has what can only be described as a profound religious experience. And it's, in the theological sense, it's completely gratuitous. It's gratuitous to the novel. It's gratuitous to her. It's unexpected, it's uncalled for. It's an experience of being touched by someone whom she just calls a stranger. And while it affects her profoundly, it's not central to the storyline. But it just strikes me that that's something that I don't think I'd ever come across in a science fiction setting, where someone actually has what can only be described as a religious experience. And like, you know, it's the Greg Bear who wrote it can only have done this out of actually reading mystics. It's an accurate description. So, you know, I just wondered if you'd come across other instances of that where they're like, you know, we've talked a lot about organized religion, but this is just the basic thing, the basic experience of being loved, which is how she ends up explaining it. It was, you are loved is the message that comes through to this person.
There is a film that comes to mind with a similar theme, and that is the Robert Zemeckis film Contact.
All right, yes.
The character played by Jodie Foster is a deeply committed atheist.
Yeah.
She has a transcendent experience that she cannot demonstrate by proof of evidence, but she knows it's real and she can't explain it, but she's profoundly moved by it. And it does not fit at all into any of her scientific sort of constructed worldview. In a sense, it's not quite what you're describing because it is at the heart of the story itself.
Yes, that's the difference.
I mean, the interesting thing there is, of course, that Carl Sagan, who wrote the novel, was agnostic at best, you know, if not atheistic,
but yet interested in the idea of a religious experience and of a dialogue partner that's interested in God and belief in God. So it's this thing you know, it's a part of who we are. It's hard to get away from. I think your example of it's unusual in writing to have a significant experience that's not clear how it fits as part of the storyline. But if that's the case, maybe it's one of those examples, a classic example of independence model. Here's religion and religious experience, and it exists, and it's not invalidated, but it doesn't seem to connect to what's going on in the rest of the story in the science fiction part. But there are examples, and the trilogy I mentioned earlier, the Australian author Ian Miller, his character has a series of rather profound encounters and experience through the realization of guilt and then being accepted and forgiven that just overwhelm him and take him through the whole trilogy to really come to terms with how that's changed him, and that these are profoundly religious experiences, but it's also at the heart of the plot of the novel. So it's integrated. So I think that idea of religious experience and mystical experiences can come in there, but perhaps we tend to find them more in other genres than in science fiction. Science fiction writers tend to be eager to get down to, you know, the dimensions of the spacecraft and the weapons used, the light speed, and get away from that all emotional stuff that, you know, they leave that to fantasy writers.
I think that just while I've got the floor, I love Frank Herbert's work, and I've read the Dune stuff, but he also has that interesting trilogy, the Jesus incident, the Lazarus effect, and the ascension factor. And often the chapter headings of those, there'll be a little epithet, which is a quote from Teilhard de Chardin, or, you know, he'll have different mystical authors and stuff like that, and he'll just put these at the head of each chapter. And it's often made me wonder about his own religious beliefs, but he doesn't seem to have anything.
He's very eclectic, but that's part of the age and the day he lived in, that kind of a vaguely religious, eclectic. He'd be hard to pin down. He's certainly interested. He reads a lot, but there doesn't be any systematic, unified view that you scratch and you find, like Tolkien. You look at Tolkien, you see in his fantasy that the Christian beliefs come through. But with Herbert, you see religious interest, but dependent down on what his specific beliefs are. I just think he's a true religious eclectic.
Yeah. Thanks for that. Doru, you had your hand up.
Thanks, Mark and Glenn. Awesome presentations, very challenging. I take my cue from the last minute or so of conversation, talking about, let's call them mystical experiences. It's interesting how in Philip K. Dick's universe, in the Baylis novels, you have a technological experience that is so strange, so exotic, that the main character has to grapple with it, and the best he can do is by making use of let's call it religious imagery and concepts and ideas. Of course, those concepts come from Gnosticism, and it's very interesting that in the Baylis novels, this whatever strange technological experience leads to some kind of religion. Of course, we know the context, but it's not the best. The fact that schizophrenic interprets a technological experience as religious or mystical. But I think the device itself, the strategy itself is very interesting, showing how, in a way, even experiences that have to do with, let's say, advanced civilizations would require, at least for us earthlings, some kind of cultural reference. And in this case, Philip K. Dick uses religious philosophy, I repeat, Gnostic philosophy, but religious nonetheless. Now, I would like to turn the table and ask if we couldn't do the same by using, say, stuff, even sci-fi stuff, in order to communicate by way of cultural references, messages that have to do with our gospel convictions, our faith convictions, and so on and so forth. And on this note, I turn to one of the points I would like to make, and it has to do with Robert's question. As a matter of fact, we have a classical example of Christian guidance offered for a technological society. And that's the third part of C.S. Lewis's space trilogy mentioned by Mark. That last part of the trilogy, what's its?
Oh,
that hideous strength. That hideous strength. Yeah, you have technology gone haywire, and you have the little remnant, the pocket of Christians, that are sort of maintaining some kind of normality and wisdom given their Christian convictions, and eventually they manage to defeat the darkness. So that's a very interesting example of reversing the tables. Now, can we do something like this? Especially those among you who are literary inclined. For example, to take the name of Teilhard de Chardin, mentioned a few times already, and take his very Christ-centered narrative, let's call it scientific or philosophical scientific narrative, and make out of it this kind of channel for communicating a Christian message, a Christ-centered message within a cosmological narrative that can make not only sci-fi fans shiver with anticipation, but also Christians become more appreciative, of the genre.
There's a lot of comments and questions there. Every writer hopes that their readers will shiver with anticipation. I think we need to encourage Christians to engage and write, and not say you have to do this or that. But when you start using the imagination, when you start reading other Christian thinkers, and that's it, encouraging the imagination, creativity, and being inspired by people like Desjardins, and say, I think about the world in sacrament in a whole nother way. and the mystical relationship to God through this, and to try to get that through rather than just, I'm going to give a lecture or a talk or a sermon. Can we do it in story? You start talking about Philip K. Dick. A lot of Christians don't know what to do with it. They feel a bit uncomfortable because they want to see religion. They want to see their religion. And in Philip K. Dick, we get, kind of weird stuff. And where did that come from? But the important thing they overlook is that in a world in which many people say there's no place for religious discussion, he's talking about religious ideas, not in the terms we might be used to, and not the religion that we know. And I think, a couple of the religions he invents are just, you think, well, that's out there, but it's on the table. And we need to appreciate that and say it even though it's not our religion, and we see people putting their own religion up, it is valuing religion and its role and putting it on the table. And rather than running and hiding and saying it's not Christianity, we don't know what to do with it, we need to engage and maybe even be stimulated to write stories that have a more specifically Christian bent to them if we see the need. And that's kind of what C.S. Lewis did. He just felt there should be a need to write these kind of stories. And he did it with sci-fi and then later followed up with fantasy. And of course, the fantasy clicked a lot better for him than a sci-fi trilogy as far as with the audience, but it captured the imagination. So that's just my response, reflecting on some of the things you said. Glenn probably has more.
The only thing I would add to that would be that it would be great if Christians who wanted to do what Doru is suggesting, would not publish their novels with Christian publishing houses. So it just becomes a ghettoized thing. Well, here's a Christian science fiction book, here's a Christian science fiction novel, only Christians are going to read it. But if the work is going to have, as all good art does, have an impact on the wider society and the wider culture, then I would hope that Christian science fiction authors who want to give other than a Gnostic kind of account of the mystery of the universe would publish with mainstream publishers who are known for publishing good quality science fiction and not publish in sort of more narrow ghettoized Christian spaces.
But easier said than done for a couple of reasons. Publishing is hard in general and breaking in, but also publishers they go for certain kind of things. So if you have something that has any religious implication at all, even my biography of Graham Clark, which came out 6 years ago now, I think, it was 6 years ago. Chris remembers that we had a big launch of that. It was published by Alan Nunwin, and they were eventually happy with it, but they were a little bit hesitant because Graham was a Christian. That came out in his biography. And so they were wondering, should just go, yeah, thank you, Chris is holding it up, it exists. And that was difficult because a lot of publishers have a policy, if there's too much mention of Christianity or anything religious, they say right away, have you tried the Christian presses? Because that's what they want to compartmentalize it. So for a Christian writer to get something in the mainstream press, you have to make it very subtle, and sometimes so subtle that people don't pick it up and get it. And I think there are people doing that. Certainly, Tolkien has a strong Christian influence in his writing. We're switching to fantasy now. I know a bit more about that than sci-fi, perhaps. But that would today that would still be picked up in the mainstream press. If C.S. Lewis wrote his 7-volume Narnia series today, I don't think a secular mainstream press would touch it. They would send it right to Christian press and there are even some mainstream secular presses that have a Christian branch that publish those kind of things. So I think the industry itself is trying to compartmentalize Christianity. It's not as simple as the writers saying publish with the mainstream press. It's the system that's saying, you know what, we would like to keep Christianity departmentalized and off to the side. So if you write anything that's too obviously Christian in its content, you put it here. And then once you go to the Christian press, then they want it overtly Christian and evangelical and very pious, and it's not very interesting, or they won't touch it. If your character smokes, drinks, or has premarital sex, it's gone. If your character has any ideas that aren't orthodox theologically, it's gone. And that ends up not challenging any thinking. So it's, speaking as someone who writes and who's worked in a little bit in publishing the field, it's a bit more complicated than that, but I would like to see more of that. The question is how it can happen. Sorry, Glenn, I just
thanks. No, that's very good.
Please publish with the mainstream secular presses more often.
No, that's very good, and that's fair comment. Thank you.
But I think this is the whole point of this kind of conversation. in connection with Eastcast, because it's the idea of promoting this kind of conversation that crosses boundaries, crosses disciplines, and so on and so forth, and that can give us people from the Christian camp a language that might help us to reach out to those audiences that usually don't go to Kurong or whatever other nice Christian places.
We'd like to give Chris Mulheron an opportunity to join this conversation. Chris, thank you.
Sure. All I wanted to say was that at the Eastcast conference at the end of November, an anonymous donor has put up $7,000 for science and faith projects by students. The parameters are very broad. They would cover writing a short story, writing a science fiction story, writing a novel. The major prize will probably be $4,000. So let me encourage people, if you know likely people who can be classified as students who might write something, they don't have to write it by the end of November. They have to put forward a proposal, which we will then work on with them, and they need to write it within a year. They need to finish whatever their project is within a year. But there's a bucket of $7,000 sitting there waiting for good projects.
I'm assuming that people involved in the science theology dialogue were very familiar with Barbara's 4 models. And I just wondered how I tried to give one of the things I thought I could provide in doing this paper was to give some sort of grid that people can use for more thorough and feature analysis of works of science fiction and how they view science and faith. And I just, rather than going into any great detail in one particular story, which I have done before, I did a whole book on the Matrix trilogy, and that was fascinating. But I want to give an overview. Did that work? Did that click with people? Did you think that similarities there with Barbara worked, and that the ways of relating science and faith in the real world has some pretty rough parallels in the science fiction world? And if so, was that grid helpful for looking at science fiction? I'm just interested in feedback. If anyone had any thoughts about that's familiar with Barbara, or is thinking, I read and watch a lot of science fiction, I'm just wondering how to categorize this in terms of science and faith dialogue.
Sure.
Perhaps no one is lying awake at night wishing that they had a better grid or model for analyzing all the science fiction they read and watch in terms of how it treats religion.
Yes, well, I don't know the literature of science fiction at all, really. I've seen Star Wars. That's about it. I've read a bit of C.S. Lewis and H.G. Wells. But thank you, Mark. I found that grid very helpful. If I may just ask a quick question in relation to that, I was wondering, it strikes me, as I say, from a position of ignorance of sci-fi literature, that it's still deeply affected by a kind of supersessionist view of religion, a bit like Marxism or Durkheim. The religion has done interesting things, but humanity has reaped the fruits. We don't need religion anymore. A sort of realized eschatology, the force be with you. So religion doesn't continue as a distinct, transcendent cultural force. That seems to be very strong in science fiction.
It is, yeah.
Would that fit with one of Barbara's models? And is it still true of science fiction, would you say?
To me, either the warfare model, in which religion's losing the war, and other parts of it in the independence model, in which religion being independent just means we become irrelevant in that world. So fine, we're happy for you to be there, but we're not interested in nothing to do with it. So I think it does fit a little bit there in those realities. And perhaps the predominance of this, and that there's so much of it in science fiction, reflects the reality that is increasingly the view of religion in our world, and probably has been for some time, because these models don't just show up in the last 30, 40 years. We find this negative view of religion going back to fairly early days of science fiction. When I first started looking at the study, I thought I might see an evolution of these kind of models with one replacing the other over the last century of science fiction, from its early days to its heyday and classic period in the 50s and 60s and beyond. But I found examples of all the models within all the ages of the stages of science fiction. So it's not new, but it does seem to be gaining in its cultural impact, this view of religion and probably gives us yet another window of insight and evidence into what's going on in the world around us, and how, you know, religion is viewed and taken in society.
Thank you. Thank you. It's very interesting.
I think we might allow our speaker to rest and thank him for his contribution, and Glen as well for his response to your paper and joining in the discussion. I might little part of my own life. I think when I had my 13th birthday, I asked my parents for tickets to go and see 2001: A Space Odyssey. It was just out, and of course, it blew my mind. I believe that Arthur C. Clarke and Stanley Kubrick, in conversation, once said, what the film studio doesn't realize is they've just spent however many $1 million making a religious film. It's interesting that they both Clarke and Kubrick saw it as that. And certainly as a young kid, that it had that sort of religious overtones for me at the time. Yes, an interesting observation for someone who, as you said, was more a secular humanist and not particularly sympathetic to religion, but did see the film in those terms. Great conversation. Thank you to all who participated. May we thank our speakers in the usual way. So thank you very much.
Everyone.
Thank you.